The yeas are 50, the nays are 49, and the motion is agreed to. The clerk will report the resolution.
Calendar number 122, S-Con Res 14, setting forth the congressional budget for the United States government for fiscal year 2022 and setting forth the appropriate budgetary levels for fiscal years 2023 through 2031.
Senator from Vermont.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that for the duration of the Senate's consideration of S-Con Res 14, the budget resolution for fiscal year 2021, the majority and the Republican managers of the resolution, while seated or standing at the managers' desks, be permitted to deliver floor remarks, retrieve, review, and edit documents, and send email and other data communications from text displayed on wireless personal digital assistant devices and tablet devices. I further ask unanimous consent that the use of calculators be permitted on the floor during consideration of the budget resolution. Further, that the staff be permitted to make technical and conforming changes to the resolution, if necessary, consistent with the amendments adopted during Senate consideration, including calculating the associated change in the net interest function and incorporating the effect of such adopted amendments on the budgetary aggregates for federal revenues, the amount by which the federal revenues should be changed, new budget authority, budget outlays, deficits, public debt, and debt held by the public. Finally, that the following staff members from my staff and from Senator Graham's staff be given all access floor passes for consideration of the resolution. Majority staff, Michael Jones, Joshua Smith, Melissa Kaplan Pistoner, Billy Jindal, and Liam Fagan. Republican staff, Nick Myers, Matthew Giroux, Matthew Joe Keeley, Becky Cole, and Chris Ann Pierce.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that there be 2 minutes for debate equally divided prior to each vote during consideration of S-Con Res 14.
Is there objection? Without objection.
President, let me begin by thanking President Biden and Majority Leader Schumer for their leadership in the arduous process which has gotten us to where we are right now. Mr. President, I do understand that many of my Republican colleagues are in a bit of shock. They're in a bit of shock now. They are finding it hard to believe that the President and the Democratic caucus are prepared to go forward in addressing the long-neglected needs of working families and not just the 1% and wealthy campaign contributors. That's not the way things usually happen around here. Usually it's the big money interests, the campaign contributors, and the lobbyists who call the tunes. But not today. Today, we move this country in a very different direction. Mr. President, the American people are sick and tired of growing income and wealth inequality in our country, where two people now own more wealth than the bottom 40%, where the top 1% owns more wealth than the bottom 92%, and where 45% of all new income has gone to the top 1% since 2009. In other words, the people on top are doing phenomenally well. Meanwhile, while the very rich have become much richer, the gross unfairness of our current tax system has allowed in a given year some of the wealthiest people in our country and some of the largest and most profitable corporations to not pay a nickel in a given year in federal income tax, not one penny. Well, that is about to change. The American people want a government which represents all of us and not just the few. And this legislation is going to ask the wealthiest people in our country to start paying their fair share of taxes so that we can address the needs of working families, the elderly, the children, the sick, and the poor. And despite what some of my Republican colleagues may be saying, no one in America who makes less than $400,000 a year will pay a nickel more in federal taxes. In fact, what we are looking at in this budget proposal is an historic tax cut for working families and the middle class. Further, and importantly, at a time when California is on fire, when Oregon is on fire, when Greece is burning, and when countries throughout the world are experiencing unprecedented drought, which will clearly impact food production, this legislation begins the process of combating climate change so that our kids and grandchildren can live in a country and a planet which is healthy and habitable. It would be immoral and an absolute dereliction of our responsibilities as elected officials to do anything less. We cannot ignore climate change any longer. Now is the time for our great country to lead the world out of this existential crisis. And by the way, as we address the long-neglected needs of working families and as we combat climate change, we are going to create millions of good-paying jobs, many of them union jobs. Let me very briefly take this opportunity to describe some of what is in this budget proposal. First, we are going to address the disgrace of the United States having the highest rate of childhood poverty of almost any major country on earth. This is the wealthiest country on earth, and we should not have millions of our children living in poverty. This budget is going to provide the long-awaited for help that working parents all over this country desperately need. And when we do that, we will substantially reduce childhood poverty in America. And we're going to do that by extending the child tax credit so that families continue to receive monthly direct payments of up to $300 per child. We began that process in the American Rescue Plan. It has been enormously successful in Vermont and all over this country as parents finally get the help that they need to raise their kids. And in fact, it has helped reduce childhood poverty in our country by 61%. And we are going to extend those child tax credits. Further, we're going to help working parents by addressing the crisis in childcare, by making sure that no working family in our country pays more than 7% of their income for childcare. And all over this country, talking to parents in Vermont, elsewhere, people are paying 25% of their income for childcare so that they can go to work. That makes no sense at all. And under our proposal, no working family will pay more than 7%. And when we do that, when we make childcare more affordable and accessible, it will allow over 1 million women who are now home with their kids to re-enter the workforce and improve our economy. And further, in terms of addressing the needs of our working parents and their kids, we will expand public education by providing universal pre-K to every 3- and 4-year-old in the country. Madam President, this budget proposal is going to end the international disgrace of the United States being the only major country on earth not to guarantee paid family and medical leave as a right. Somebody who is sick today should not be forced to go to work and maybe by expanding their illness by contagion, make other people sick. Parents should be able to stay home with their sick children. And when a woman has a baby, she should not be forced back into work a week after giving birth simply because she has no income to stay home. Yes, in America, we will join every other major country and guarantee paid family and medical leave. And Madam President, we will begin to address the crisis in higher education by making community colleges in America tuition-free. And this will give millions of young people and working people the opportunity to get the education they need to acquire the skills so they can go out and get the good-paying jobs that are out there. It will also give people the opportunity to transfer the 2 years of credits earned at a community college to a 4-year school. Now, I hope in years to come we will go further, but 2 years of free community college is no small thing. Madam President, this budget proposal begins the process of taking on the greed of the pharmaceutical industry and saving taxpayers hundreds of billions of dollars by requiring that Medicare negotiate prescription drug prices with the pharmaceutical industry. It is not acceptable to me and to the American people that we continue to pay by far the highest prices in the world for prescription drugs. Medicare must negotiate prescription drug prices, and this budget sets the stage for that to happen. And Madam President, we will use the savings acquired by negotiating prescription drug prices in Medicare by expanding Medicare. We're going to use those savings to expand Medicare to cover the dental care, the hearing aids, the eyeglasses that seniors desperately need. This is the wealthiest country on earth, and yet we have millions of senior citizens who lack teeth in their mouth. They need dentures. They can't afford to get it. They need hearing aids in order to communicate with their grandkids. Can't afford to do that. They need a decent pair of glasses. Can't afford that. And in terms of health care, we will also substantially increase the number of doctors, nurses, and dentists who practice in underserved areas and expand the community health center program into new areas as well. Madam President, this budget proposal will combat homelessness in America and address the reality that nearly 18 million households are paying over 50% of their limited incomes for housing through an unprecedented investment in affordable housing. We will ensure further that people in an aging society, we're getting older as a society, and that we will ensure that those people can receive the health care they need in their own homes instead of being forced into expensive and inadequate nursing homes, and that the workers who provide that important care to the elderly and the disabled are not forced to exist on starvation wages. This is such important work and such emotionally draining work. Those folks deserve a decent paycheck. And Madam President, we will bring undocumented people out of the shadows and provide them with a pathway to citizenship, including those very brave workers who have courageously kept our economy going in the middle of a deadly pandemic. Madam President, as I mentioned earlier, we will take on the existential threat of climate change by transforming our energy system toward renewable energy and energy efficiency. Among many other provisions in terms of climate change, we will establish a civilian climate corps which will give hundreds of thousands of young people good-paying jobs and educational benefits as they roll up their sleeves and get to work to help us save the planet. This budget proposal, will make it easier, not harder, for workers to join unions in America. Madam President, my Republican colleagues are upset that we are using the reconciliation process and only 50 votes to pass this budget. They're very upset about that. But let us be clear. This idea of using reconciliation is certainly not a new idea. When Republicans controlled the Senate, they used reconciliation to pass trillions of dollars in tax breaks to the top 1% and large corporations. When Republicans controlled the Senate, they used reconciliation to make climate change worse by opening up the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge to oil drilling. When Republicans controlled the Senate, they tried to use reconciliation to repeal the Affordable Care Act and throw 32 million Americans off of the health care they had. Well, today it is true. We will also use reconciliation, but we will do it in a different way. We will use it to help the working families of our country and not just the wealthy and the powerful. Madam President, it is no great secret that millions of Americans are giving up on democracy, are moving toward authoritarianism, and are losing faith in their government. Many of those people are working longer hours for lower wages. They can't afford health care. They can't afford to send their kids to college, and they worry very much about the future of their kids and the future of this country. This legislation will not only provide enormous support, unprecedented in recent American history, to the children in our country, to the parents in our country, to the elderly people in our country, to the working families of our country, but it will also, I hope, restore the faith of the American people in the belief that we can have a government that works for all of us and not just the few. Thank you, Madam President.
Hey, Madam President.
Senator from South Carolina.
Thank you.
Good to see you back.
Good to be back. Thank you for the inquiries about my well-being to all my colleagues. I appreciate the good wishes and the phone calls and the food, and I made it. I think the worst is behind me. I want to reinforce a simple message. If you haven't been vaccinated regarding the COVID problem, you need to get vaccinated. I've been vaccinated, and I got COVID anyway. Couple of really bad days, but I'm doing better, and I feel on the mend, and I'm confident if I hadn't had the vaccine, it'd have been a lot worse. So in my state, about 50% of the people are still unvaccinated. Just for your own good and the good of our state, I would urge you to consider getting vaccinated. I think the vaccine is safe and it works, and it certainly, I'm glad I had it, and the sooner we can get to herd immunity through vaccinations and other means, the better off we'll be. So to all my colleagues and people back home, thank you for the kind words and the inquiries. Now, but we're back at work, and I'm glad I was able to make this debate. I think this is a debate worth having. We just passed a $1 trillion infrastructure bill. The presiding officer, Senator Sinema from Arizona, was one of the architects of the bill. Congratulations. I voted for it because it made sense to me. We've been talking about infrastructure here for 5 or 10 years, and this $1 trillion package, 550 of new spending, which I believe to be paid for, goes into ports, roads, and bridges, and rural broadband. 19 Republicans voted for it. I'm hoping we can make it reality and get it to President Biden's desk, because I think infrastructure is much needed, and we were finding bipartisanship in that space. Now we're moving on to something completely different. I dare say radical. Right after the majority was seized by the Democratic Party, you pushed through a $1.9 trillion package. It had a lot to talk about COVID, but most of it wasn't related to COVID as we know it, after we'd worked together on $4 trillion of spending. Now, this budget resolution is proposing $3.5 trillion of additional spending, and we'll talk about how that affects you, the public, here in a minute. But the first thing I want you to know, it's not $3.5 trillion. That's not accurate. When you look at the increase in public debt and the authorization of new discretionary spending, it's at least 4.2. So it's not $3.5 trillion, it's over $4 trillion. The first thing you got to do is be honest with the product you're selling. This will cost well over $4 trillion if fully implemented. What else does this bill do that people in this body need to know about? It changes the rule regarding emergency spending. Right now, we can spend through an emergency basically unlimited money and not have to worry about offsets and all that good stuff because it's truly an emergency. But you need 60 votes to declare something an emergency. This budget resolution will change that rule so that a simple majority of senators can determine anything they would like to be an emergency and spend without any accountability. I think that's a bad idea for the body, because anything you could do, we can do, and it really is an assault on the idea of minority rights. I think it's the biggest blow to the institution yet. It's buried in this bill, but it eliminates the 60-vote requirement to declare items emergency spending, replacing it with a simple majority, allowing a majority, a single party, to spend without restriction in the name of emergency. So to my friends on the other side, you need to look at what's in this bill, and I hope you will find that to be unacceptable change to the United States Senate. because when it comes to spending, it guts the idea that the minority matters, because all you have to do, if this budget resolution is implemented the way they've written it, is to declare something emergency, get 50 votes, and spend. Very bad idea. We're going to try to change that, and we hope we can find some bipartisan support. So let me tell you about this bill. I'm going to ask some questions. On the immigration side, Senator Sanders said that this bill creates millions of new green cards for people here illegally. So here's a question. If we told the world that in the budget reconciliation we're going to increase millions of green cards for people here illegally, do you think that would entice more people to come here illegally? Here's what I think. I think that's the dumbest idea I could think of. In the middle of an invasion of this country by illegal immigrants, the Democratic Party, through budget reconciliation, is going to authorize millions of new green cards for people here illegally. It's in your document. Senator Sanders admitted that. Here's what's happening as I speak. These statements are being translated into Spanish and every other language, and human traffickers all over the world are going to let the word get out that, hey, the Senate is about to increase the number of green cards available for illegal immigrants. Why don't you go and get in line? Nobody's asked the Border Patrol, how do you think this would affect our illegal immigration problem? Have you spent 15 minutes talking to anybody at the border about what this policy change would do to a broken immigration system? I guarantee you haven't, because if you talk to anybody with common sense on the border, they would tell you the last thing you need to do right now is incentivize more illegal immigration by allocating green cards to people here already illegally. What's happened in the last 6 months? A 262% increase compared to last year. Does any Democrat have any idea what's happening here? Have any of you came to the floor to explain to the American people what the hell's going on at the border? You don't have a clue. You don't care. The same people who are writing this budget resolution to spend $4 trillion on a liberal wish list are the same people in charge of the border. They haven't asked one Border Patrol professional the effect of this bill on a broken immigration system. We've had 1.2 million people come to the country illegally already. Let's compare that to last year's. A 262% increase. Illegal crossings by unaccompanied minors have surged 186% compared to last year. Why? The Biden administration has kept the COVID deportation Title 42 law in place, but it's made exception by unaccompanied minors. If you're a certain age, you can stay. Guess what? The human traffickers has found that out, and word is out all over the Northern Triangle countries, but really the world. We've had a 186% increase in unaccompanied minors because of policy changes made by the Biden administration. 27% of unaccompanied minors recently deported tested positive for COVID-19. How many of the unaccompanied minors have been released into the country? Of the 1.2 million people who have come here legally, how many of them have been released? How many of them have been tested? How many of them positive for COVID? Nobody knows these numbers because nobody seems to have a clue of what to do about it. So what are the trends? Look at this chart. Look at 2020 compared to 18, 19, and 20. An explosion of illegal immigrants. 1.2 million almost. Year to date, in 2020, we had 458,000. A 260% increase in illegal crossings at the border because the Biden administration did away with the Remain in Mexico policy, so asylum claims are through the roof. We're allowing unaccompanied children to stay as an exception to Title 42, along with families. And guess what? You have an explosion of illegal immigrant crossings in this country. If you pass this budget resolution the way Senator Sanders described, you're going to throw jet fuel on this. This number will go through the friggin' roof. Every human trafficker in the world is going to get the word out throughout the world. They're increasing the number of green cards made available to illegal immigrants in America. Come now, the time is right. What a dangerous idea, but it's part of this grand new vision for America. Let me tell you about this vision for America. Open borders, dropping people by the thousands off into the interior of the United States, not adequately tested, enticing young people to take a very dangerous journey, destroying all the gains we had, stopping a wall that was almost built. That's the vision being created by the budget resolution and then some. The idea of increasing green cards for illegal immigrants already here will make these numbers explode beyond what they are already exploding. Only God knows. Has anyone told you the price at the pump? Has anybody mentioned to you on the other side, what is the cost of this bill when we implement climate change reforms to you as a consumer? Senator Markey, who's a very passionate believer in climate change, said the Green New Deal is part of the DNA of this bill. Senator Sanders is an avowed socialist, one of the most honest people in this building. Senator Sanders' vision for the last 20 and 30 years is in this budget resolution. This budget resolution is a dream for those who want to socialize America. It's a nightmare for working people. How much has gas prices gone up in the last 6 months? $1. Here's what I think. If you implement the provisions of this budget resolution regarding climate change, you're declaring war on the internal combustion engine. You're going to shut down coal-fired plants in rural America. The question I have for my Democratic colleagues, how much will gas prices go up if this bill becomes reality? How much will your heating bill go up because you shut down supply? How has there been an increase of $1 at the pump? Policy matters. I dare say that if this bill ever is implemented, you're going to double gas prices. I hope you're listening out there, America. If they implement this radical transformation of our energy economy, you're going to have a dramatic increase of gas prices and heating prices. This is the worst thought-out idea I've ever seen. They're just throwing every liberal idea and hope it sticks to the wall, and their whole reason for being on the left is in this bill. There's a border-adjusted carbon tax proposal floating around out there. What does that mean to you? What the hell is a border-adjusted carbon tax? The best I can understand, it's going to be a tax on products coming into the country because the way the product was made is not sufficiently green enough. So they're going to charge for that product, put a tax on it at the border. Guess what? That's going to increase the cost of whatever good we're talking about. And where do you think that cost goes? It goes to you. This is the most inflationary idea I've ever seen. We've had 5.4% increase in inflation recently, wiping out all the gains in the economy. How could that be? You're spending money like drunken sailors, and if this bill ever becomes law, if it's ever implemented, and there's a border-adjusted carbon tax, it's going to be passed on to the consumer. If you're on a fixed income, this whole idea is a nightmare for you because your gas prices are going to go up, your heating bill is going to go up, and all the things that they're going to make for free will create an inflationary effect. The size of the government's going to increase dramatically. Interest rates will have to go up. So if you own a home, you drive a car, you breathe air, get ready for more taxes and more spending. All I can say is that I believe in climate change, and I'd like to have a rational approach to solving the problem, but this is not rational, this is partisan, and this $4.2 trillion bill, it's not $3.5, is going to lead to a wave of illegal immigration, the likes of which you've never seen before. A 262% increase in the last 6 months. If this bill, this idea ever becomes reality, you can double that. If this bill ever becomes reality, a $1 increase in gas prices are going to be the good old days. If they shut down all the coal-fired plants without any way to replace it other than a bunch of BS, good luck with a heating bill. They're going to change your country. It's going to be more like Venezuela and less like America. This idea is going to be paid for by taxing the rich is a bunch of BS. If you took the entire wealth of the 1%, including their cars and their dogs, it's less than half we need to deal with the entitlement problems we already have. And you're growing exponentially the size of government. More government to pay for. Eventually, interest rates are going to have to go up. You're putting in motion, I think, the demise of America as we know it. You're putting in motion a government that nobody's grandchild can ever afford to pay. You're putting in motion the destruction of energy independence. You've declared war on the fossil fuel industry in this country. And you've not done a damn thing about China, India, Russia, or Iran. So the bottom line here is if you believe in energy independence, then you need to vote against this budget resolution because we'll lose it. If you believe that inflation is a death blow to the middle class, you need to vote against this budget resolution. If you don't know how much gas prices are going to be increased, they owe you an answer. So I'm going to ask this question for the next 15 hours. Do you have any idea, if all this becomes reality, how much increase at the pump will be affected by the average consumer in the next year? How much will our heating bills go up? As to the border-adjusted carbon tax, will it be inflationary? Where does the money go from the tax? Who gets it? Little details like this. All I can say is that everybody has a dream in America. There's the American dream and the American socialist dream for America. This budget resolution sets in motion an assault on free enterprise, the destruction of energy independence, incentivizing illegal immigration at a time we can afford it the least. If you don't believe these things, then you haven't read what's in this blueprint. Have you ever asked yourself the question, what the hell has happened in the last 6 months? Why are we up $1 a gallon at the pump? Because they've declared war on fossil fuels made in America. Why do we have a 262% increase in illegal immigration? Because they changed all the policies that worked at the border. Why is inflation rising? Because the fiscal policies of the Biden administration and our friends on the left are driving up prices. The worst is yet to come. If this budget resolution becomes a reality, God help the American middle class, we'll be less energy dependent. Our money will go not nearly as far. You're going to have to dramatically raise taxes if you intend to pay for this monstrosity. And some Democrats have said it's got to be paid for. There's no way in hell to pay for this bill unless you fundamentally raise taxes across the board at a time we're struggling to get back on our feet. So this is why we have elections. In 2022, this idea will be on the ballot. And my goal and my Republican colleagues is to fight like hell to stop the increase at the pump, stop an increase of your heating bills, and to stop an invasion of our country by illegal immigrants, all driven by bad policy choices. But everything they've done in the last 6 months pales in comparison to what they're going to do for this country if this budget resolution ever becomes a reality. So yes, sir, we're going to have one hell of a fight. I don't know how long we're going to be here, but as long as it takes, America is worth fighting for. And America, as we know her, is at risk through this budget resolution. Thank you.
Let them have this conversation. When they give us a high sign, then.
Am I going?
Yes, go ahead.
Madam President,
The senator from Vermont.
I ask unanimous consent that it be in order to call up the following amendments, that they be reported by number, and that the Senate vote in relation to the amendments in the order listed, with no amendments in order prior to a vote. Barrasso, 3055, Carper, 3330, Thune, 3106, Cortez Masto, 3317.
Is there objection? Without objection.
I yield the remaining Republican time on the I yield the remaining Republican time on the resolution.
The senator has that right.
I yield the majority's remaining time for the resolution.
The senator has that right. All time on the resolution has been yielded back. Yes.
Madam President.
Senator from Wyoming.
Thank you, Madam President. I call up my amendment number 3055 and ask that it be reported by number.
The clerk will record the amendment by number.
The senator from Wyoming, Mr. Barrasso, proposes an amendment number 3055.
There will now be 2 minutes of debate, equally divided.
Madam President. Madam President, I'm offering this amendment to spare the country from the so-called Green New Deal. The Green New Deal is not about protecting the environment. It's about making big government even bigger. This socialist scheme would destroy jobs. It will reduce the quality of life for the American people. Millions and millions of Americans will suffer. It would worsen already high inflation. It will drive a stake through the economy and eventually bankrupt the nation. Senate Democrats have made it clear that they want to use this reckless tax and spending spree to implement the Green New Deal. Just last night, Senator Markey of Massachusetts made this statement. He says, without question, the Green New Deal is in the DNA of this budget resolution. Let me repeat. He said, without question, the Green New Deal is in the DNA of this budget resolution. Instead of raising costs on energy, we should be working to lower the cost of alternative technologies and fuels through innovation, not taxation and regulation. So I would encourage a yes vote on the Barrasso amendment and reject the job-killing Green New Deal.
Madam President,
The senator from Vermont.
Mr. Barrasso's amendment is interesting when he talks about the Green New Deal. The only problem is what he's talking about has nothing to do with the Green New Deal. Despite what Senator Barrasso says, the Green New Deal would not ship jobs overseas. In fact, it will create millions of good-paying jobs in the United States of America. It will not raise electricity prices. It will not make the United States dependent on dirty sources of energy from other countries. In case the senator from Wyoming has missed it, Oregon is burning. California is burning. Greece is burning. There is a drought hitting virtually every country on Earth. Newsflash, climate change is real, and the United States and other countries have got to address it. Madam President, as a supporter of the Green New Deal, I have no problem voting for this amendment because it has nothing to do with the Green New Deal.
The question is on the amendment.
Yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Langford. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lujan. Ms. Lummis. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. Mr. Marshall. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative. Barrasso, Bozeman, Cantwell, Carper, Casey, Cassidy, Coons, Cornyn, Kramer, Crapo, Graham, Hassan, Heinrich, Hirono, King, Merkley, Moran, Paul, Peters, Romney, Rubio, Sanders, Sass, Schatz, Scott of Florida, Smith, Tillis, Tuberville, Whitehouse. Mr. Wyden, aye. Mr. Tester, Mr. Tester, aye. Mr. Durbin, aye. Mr. Cotton, aye. Ms. Ernst, aye. Mr. McConnell, aye. Ms. Cortez Masto, aye. Mr. Burr, aye. Mr. Marshall, aye. Mr. Braun, Mr. Braun, aye. Mr. Kane, aye. Mr. Kennedy, aye. Mrs. Capito, aye. Mrs. Blackburn, aye. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Warner, aye. Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. Grassley, aye. Mr. Langford, aye. Mr. Inhofe, aye. Mr. Leahy, aye. Mrs. Murray, aye. Miss Cinema, aye. Miss Lummis, aye. Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Mr. Daines, aye. Mr. Wicker, aye. Mrs. Hyde Smith, aye. Haggerty. Miss Stabenow, aye. Mr. Hawley, aye. Miss Rosen, aye. Miss Baldwin. Miss Baldwin, aye. Mr. Blunt, aye. Mr. Kelly, aye. Mr. Bennett, aye. Mr. Manchin, aye. Mr. Ossoff, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Toomey, aye. Ms. Collins, aye. Mr. Thune, aye. Oh, Mrs. Fisher, aye. Mr. Warnock, aye. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mr. Cardin, aye. Mr. Menendez, aye. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mr. Haggerty, aye. Mr. Booker, aye. Mr. Lee, aye.
My family's there right now. I'm supposed to be there. I missed the whole vacation. They're right now. Glaciers, geysers.
We're good.
My husband and daughter are there.
Mr. Cruz, aye. Ms. Warren, aye. Mr. Brown, aye. Mr. Van Hollen, aye. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Markey, aye. Mr. Lujan, aye. Ms. Duckworth, aye. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Portman, aye. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, aye. Mr. Shelby, aye. Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Padilla, aye. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Hickenlooper, aye. Mr. Johnson, aye.
The yeas are 99, the nays are 0. The amendment is agreed to. I'm sorry.
Madam President, the Senate is not in order.
The Senate is not in order. The Senate will be in order. We do indeed have a long way to go. The Senator from Delaware.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I call up my amendment number 3330 and ask that it be reported by number.
The clerk will report the amendment by number.
The senator from Delaware, Mr. Carper, proposes an amendment number 3330.
There are now 2 minutes of debate, equally divided.
Madam President, the amendment that I've called up is clear, it is simple, and it is straightforward. It makes clear that we are going to address the climate crisis. We're going to do it through policies to do several things. One, create jobs. Two, create jobs here in the United States.
The Senate will come to order. Members, take your conversations off the floor. The Senator from Delaware.
Thank you, Madam President. Policies that will strengthen our economy, all while reducing the pollution that hurts our health and our environment. Madam President, we're in a code red situation. This is all hands on deck when it comes to the climate crisis. We don't have a moment to waste. We need to put politics aside and act now on climate change. The budget resolution should allow us to develop legislation that can respond to urgent challenge of climate change. And I ask my colleagues to join me in supporting this amendment. I yield.
President.
The Senator from Wyoming.
Madam President, I rise to oppose the Carper amendment. Let's be clear. We all want to address climate change, period. Now, this amendment does much more than that. Just because you say you want to address climate change does not mean every policy that you propose is a good idea. There can be disagreement, and I disagree strongly with the Green New Deal policies in this $4.2 trillion bill that wastes taxpayer dollars, it costs hundreds of jobs, and it hurts our economy. Our economy should be a priority here. It should be the priority. We can protect the environment without punishing the economy, and this bill and amendment fails that test. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.
If there's no further debate, the question is on the amendment. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Braun. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young, Senators voting in the affirmative: Baldwin, Bennett, Blumenthal, Booker, Brown, Cantwell, Cardin, Carper, Coons, Cortez Masto, Duckworth, Durbin, Gillibrand, Hassan, Heinrich, Hickenlooper, Kelly, Leahy, Markey, Menendez, Murray, Ossoff, Peters, Reed, Rosen, Sanders, Schatz, Shaheen, Sinema, Smith, Stabenow, Warren, Whitehouse, and Wyden. Senators voting in the negative: Barrasso, Bozeman, Capito, Cassidy, Kramer, Crapo, Cruz, Daines, Ernst, Fisher, Graham, Grassley, Hawley, Inhofe, Johnson, Kennedy, Lee, Lummis, Marshall, Paul, Risch, Romney, Sass, Scott of Florida, Scott of South Carolina, Shelby, Sullivan, Tillis, and Tuberville. Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Mr. Young, no. Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, no. Mr. Cornyn, no. Mr. Cotton, no. Mr. Warner, aye. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mr. Casey, aye. Mr. Toomey, no. Mr. Thune, no. Mr. Langford, no. Mr. Lujan, aye. Ms. Hirono, aye. Mr. Rubio, no. Mr. Blunt, Mr. Blunt, no. Mr. Mr. Wicker, no. Mr. Burr, no. Ms. Murkowski, no. Mr. Hoven, no. Mr. Van Hollen, aye. Mr. Moran, no. Mrs. Blackburn, no. Mr. Kane, aye. Mr. King, aye. Mr. Haggerty, no. Mr. Portman, no. Mr. Braun, no. Mr. Padilla, aye. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Tester, aye. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Merkley, aye. Mr. Manchin, aye. Ms. Collins, aye. Mr. Warnock, aye. Mr. McConnell, no.
The nays are 48, and the amendment is agreed to.
Madam President.
The senator from South Dakota.
Madam President, I rise in support of Thune Amendment 3106, which would preserve the long-standing step-up in basis for family-owned businesses, farms, and ranches. For decades, the tax code has allowed family-run businesses to be handed down without imposing capital gains taxes on the appreciation and value from the prior generation. Changing this would hit generationally owned enterprises hard, particularly in rural communities, and it could force families to sell off part of the farm or business just to pay the new tax. Congress tried something similar before and had to repeal the tax before it took effect because it was unworkable. Unlike Amendment 3317, which is the side-by-side the Democrats will be offering here temporarily, which would simply delay the tax, My amendment would provide permanent relief by preserving step-up in basis for all family-owned businesses, farms, and ranches, and I encourage my colleagues to support it, and would add that I have letters of support from the National Association of Manufacturers, NFIB, Family Business Estate Tax Coalition, Taxpayers Protection Alliance, Council for Citizens Against Government Waste, Americans for Tax Reform, National Taxpayers Union, Center for a Free Economy, Family Business Coalition, Small Business Entrepreneurship Council, and CASE. Mr. President, I urge the adoption of this amendment.
Does the senator wish to call up his amendment?
I call up Amendment 3106 and ask that it be reported by number.
Great.
Madam President.
The clerk will report the amendment by number.
Senator from South Dakota, Mr. Thune, proposes an amendment numbered 3106.
The senator from Oregon.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, Senate Democrats take a back seat to no one in standing up for family farmers, ranchers, and small businesses. In fact, President Biden has made it clear that any changes to stepped-up basis will provide durable protection for family farmers, ranchers, and small businesses. Speaking for myself, Senator Cortez Masto, and Senator Tester, we are following through on that Biden pledge because it is both fair and common sense. Now, capital gains reform is about ensuring that the wealthiest pay their fair share. On our watch, multi-billionaires cannot plant a few tomatoes and call themselves a family farmer. I will vote for the Thune amendment, as well as the important Cortez Masto Tester Wyden amendment that will be taken up next.
The question is on the amendment. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Boozman, Mr. Thank you. Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, thank you. Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, I got you. Ms. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, thank you. What? Thank you. Thank you. Mrs. Fisher. Aye. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Haggerty. I did. Thank you. Yeah, you. Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Hickenlooper. Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez. No? Okay. Thank you. Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mr. Murray, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, thank you, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young, Mrs. Gillibrand, no. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Thune 3106 is agreed to. Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Portman, aye. Mr. Rubio, aye. Senators voting in the affirmative: Bennett, Blackburn, Blumenthal, Blunt, Bozeman, Braun, Brown, Burr, Cantwell, Cassidy, Collins, Cornyn, Cortez Masto, Kramer, Daines, Duckworth, Durbin, Ernst, Fisher, Gillibrand, Graham, Grassley, Hassan, Heinrich, Heidsmith, Inhofe, Johnson, Kelly, Kennedy, Lankford, Lee, Lujan, Lummis, Markey, Marshall, McConnell, Menendez, Murray, Paul, Portman, Romney, Rubio, Sanders, Sass, Schatz, Scott of South Carolina, Shaheen, Sinema, Smith, Stabenow, Sullivan, Thune, Tillis, Toomey, Tuberville, Wicker, Wyden, and Young. No senator voted in the negative. Mr. Cardin, aye. Mr. Leahy, aye. Mr. Crapo, aye. Mr. Peters, aye. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Mr. Shelby, aye. Mr. Coons, aye. Mr. Carper, aye. Mr. Scott of Florida, aye. Mrs. Capito, aye. Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Reed, aye. Ms. Rosen, aye. Ms. Hirono, aye. Mr. Ossoff, aye. Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mr. Hoven, aye. Casey didn't vote. Oh, I'm sorry. You looking at time? We've used 13 minutes. Mr. Casey, aye. Ms. Warren, aye. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mr. Cotton, aye. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Mr. Booker, aye. Mr. Haggerty, aye. Mr. Barrasso, aye. Mr. Warner, aye. Mr. Van Hollen, aye. Mr. Hickenlooper, aye. Mr. Kane, aye. Mr. Manchin, no. Mr. Warnock, aye. Mr. Tester, aye. Mr. King, aye. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Padilla, aye. Mr. Manchin, aye. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Merkley, aye. Mr. Cruz, aye. Mr. Hawley, aye.
Where's everyone going in between these votes? We literally have nothing else to do. Okay, all right. The yeas are 99, the nays are 0, and the amendment is agreed to. The senator from Vermont.
Unanimous consent that following the Cortez Masto amendment, the following amendments be in order, that the amendments be reported by number with no amendments in order prior to a vote in relation to the amendment. Loomis 3104, Hassan Young 3278, Crapo 3099, Wyden 3365, Kramer 3105, Scott 3073, Rubio 3097.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered.
Madam President.
The senator from Nevada.
Madam President, I call up my amendment number 3317 and ask that it be reported by number.
The clerk will report by number.
The senator from Nevada, Ms. Cortez Masto, for herself and others, proposes an amendment number 3317. Thank you. Madam President, I am joined on this amendment by Senators Tester, Wyden, and Warnock. Our amendment will protect family farms, ranches, and small businesses while ensuring that the wealthy pay their fair share. Family-owned businesses, farms, and ranches are the backbone of the American economy. Many of these family-owned businesses have held their assets for generations and have a deep connection to the land they inherit. They are essential to feeding America. Congress should protect these multi-generational, hardworking families who have spent a lifetime creating jobs, building businesses, and serving their communities. We are committed to protecting these family-owned businesses while ensuring that the top 1% in corporations pay their fair share. Madam President, I ask for the yeas and nays.
Madam President.
Is there a sufficient second?
Madam President.
There appears to be.
Madam President.
The yeas and nays are ordered. The senator from South Dakota.
Madam President, I appreciate the support of my colleagues in acknowledging the full benefit of step-up in basis for all businesses. This amendment proposed by the senator from Nevada dilutes that support. As I previously described, the administration's proposal would end the existing step-up in basis tax treatment that protects generationally owned businesses from tax liability when the business is passed on to the next generation. And I might add, I said this earlier, this was tried once in the 1970s. Chuck Grassley was here. And he was the guy who helped end this because it was unworkable. So here we are trying to do this all over again. The administration suggested it might include arbitrary exemptions to this ill-advised idea, which I think is what the Cortez Masto amendment speaks to. But unfortunately, these so-called protections for family-owned operations would not provide sustained relief and in practice would be incredibly difficult to implement. The reason they didn't do it in the 1970s, we have never taxed unrealized gains in this country. This proposal is a half measure that would still punish hardworking families and businesses in this country, and I urge my colleagues to oppose it.
The question is on the amendment. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Badia, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young, Senators voting in the affirmative: Bennett, Booker, Cantwell, Cardin, Casey, Cortez Masto, Duckworth, Durbin, Gillibrand, Hassan, Heinrich, Hirono, Kane, Kelly, King, Leahy, Lujan, Manchin, Menendez, Merkley, Murray, Ossoff, Padilla, Reed, Rosen, Schatz, Schumer, Shaheen, Smith, Stabenow, Tester, Warner, Warren, and Wyden. Senators voting in the negative: Barrasso, Blackburn, Blunt, Braun, Burr, Capito, Cassidy, Collins, Cornyn, Cotton, Kramer, Cruz, Daines, Ernst, Grassley, Hawley, Hoeven, Hyde-Smith, Inhofe, Kennedy, Lankford, Lee, Lummis, Marshall, Paul, Portman, Risch, Romney, Sass, Scott of South Carolina, Shelby, Sinema, Thune, Tillis, Tuberville, and Young. Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mr. Crapo, no. Mrs. Fisher, no. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Mr. Markey, aye. Mr. Scott of Florida, no. Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Mr. Graham, no. Mr. Toomey, Mr. Toomey, no. Mr. Moran, Mr. Moran, no. Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Mr. Johnson, no. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Wicker, no. Mr. Coons, aye. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mr. Brown, aye. Mr. Peters, aye. Mr. Sanders, aye. Mr. Van Hollen, aye. Mr. Haggerty, no. Mr. Hickenlooper. Mr. Hickenlooper, aye. Ms. Murkowski. Ms. Murkowski, no. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Bozeman, no. Mr. Warnock. Mr. Warnock, aye. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Rubio, no. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McConnell, no. Mr. Carper. Mr. Carper, aye. Mr. Sullivan, no.
The yeas are 49, the nays are 50, and the amendment is not agreed to.
I think you'll be saying that a few times tonight.
The senator from Wyoming.
Madam President, I call up my amendment number 3104 and ask that it be reported by number.
The clerk will report.
Senator from Wyoming, Ms. Lummis, proposes amendment number 3104.
Madam President, as Americans are trying to enjoy their last month of summer vacation before the kids go back to school, they are facing gasoline prices at a near 7-year high. What is the Biden administration doing about this? They're begging Russia and the OPEC oil cartel to pump more oil so that U.S. gasoline prices don't rise any more than they already have under his watch. Meanwhile, through various executive actions, such as the Biden ban on new oil and gas industry drilling and development, and canceling pipelines, this president is attacking American workers and American energy independence. The oil and natural gas industry supports 11.3 million jobs across the country and contributes nearly $1.7 trillion to the American economy. It makes no sense to send production to other countries when we could be doing it here, produced cleaner, more efficiently.
The senator's time has expired. Sorry.
I yield back.
Sorry.
Madam President.
Senator from West Virginia.
Madam President, Senator Loomis's amendment targets a pause on new oil and gas leases that the administration instituted while the Department of the Interior reviews our federal oil and gas leasing program. I, too, am eager to see the results of that review and was hoping that we would have received it by now. And I will continue to be vocal in my advocacy for American energy independence and addressing climate change through innovation, not elimination. However, drilling continued on existing leases throughout the pause, and Secretary Holland testified before the Energy Committee that the Department is in compliance with the recent court order, which still allows leasing. And I believe the administration has a responsibility to evaluate these programs and make sure that we're getting a reasonable return to the taxpayers while using our abundant resources in the most responsible way. For that reason, I urge my colleagues to reject the amendment.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, you're a no. Thank you. Sir, you're an aye. Yeah. Sir, no. Heinrich, Hassan-King. Sir, no. No. Thank you. No. I got you. Thank you. Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell. You're an aye. Gotcha. Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Lankford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall.
Mr. Kennedy votes aye.
Gotcha. I got you too. Thank you. Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, thank you, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young, Senators voting in the affirmative: Blackburn, Blunt, Bozeman, Capito, Cassidy, Cornyn, Kramer, Daines, Graham, Haggerty, Hyde-Smith, Johnson, Kennedy, Lankford, Lee, Lummis, Marshall, McConnell, Moran, Paul, Portman, Risch, Romney, Sass, Scott of Florida, Scott of South Carolina, Sullivan, Thune, Tillis, Toomey, and Young. Mr. Markey. Senators voting in the negative: Bennett, Blumenthal, Brown, Cardin, Coons, Cortez Masto, Gillibrand, Hassan, Heinrich, Hirono, Kelly, King, Lujan, Manchin, Markey, Menendez, Ossoff, Reed, Rosen, Sanders, Sinema, Smith, Stabenow, and Warren. Mr. Crapo, aye. Mrs. Murray, no. Mr. Schumer, no. Ms. Rosen. Oh, you did. Mr. Casey, no. Mr. Inhofe, aye. Mr. Tuberville, aye. Mrs. Fisher, aye. Mr. Braun, aye. Ms. Ernst, aye. Yes. Mrs. Feinstein, no. Mr. Leahy, no. Mr. Wicker, aye. Mr. Wyden, no. Ms. Collins, aye. Mr. Cotton, aye. Mr. Rubio, aye. Mr. Warner, no. Mr. Burr, aye. Wallace Amendment 3104 is not agreed to. Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mr. Grassley, aye. Mr. Schatz, no. Mr. Hawley, aye. Mr. Shelby, aye. Ms. Duckworth, no. Mr. Whitehouse, no. Mr. Tester, no. Mr. Kane, no. Mr. Hickenlooper, no. Ms. Cantwell, no. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Barrasso, aye. Oh, good. Awesome. Mr. Van Hollen, no. Mr. Cruz, aye. Mr. Merkley, no. Ms. Klobuchar, no. Mr. Peters, no. Mr. Carper, no. Mr. Durbin, no. Mr. Padilla, no. Mr. Booker, no. Mrs. Shaheen, no. Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Warnock, no. Turn it in.
And here's my question. The yeas are 49, the nays are 50, and the amendment is not agreed to. Oh, the senator from New Hampshire.
Madam President, I call up my amendment 3278 and ask that it be reported by number.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Senator from New Hampshire, Ms. Hassan, for herself and Mr. Young, proposes an amendment numbered 3278.
Thank you, Madam President. I rise today to offer a bipartisan amendment to promote U.S. competitiveness and support American innovation. The R&D tax credit provides critical support and tax relief to the small businesses and startups that power our economy. These businesses are job creators, helping spur innovation in New Hampshire and across the country. This bipartisan amendment with Senator Young would build on efforts to expand the R&D tax credit for startups while protecting the tax incentives that allow U.S. companies, startups, and small businesses to stay competitive in our global marketplace and outcompete China. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment and yield my time to the senator from Indiana.
Madam President, now more than ever, we must find bipartisan solutions wherever possible to stimulate our economy, get Americans back to work, and ensure we maintain our position on the world stage as the leader in scientific and technological innovation. This amendment would preserve funding related to U.S. competitiveness and innovation by retaining the full expensing for research and development and expanding tax incentives for small businesses. Immediate R&D expensing incentivizes long-term investments in innovation and technological breakthroughs. By passing this amendment, we can make sure that the United States continues to be the world leader in this space. And, Mr. President, I understand we are prepared to pass this by voice vote.
Indeed, yes.
If there's no further debate, the question is now on the amendment. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed say nay. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to.
Mr. President, I call up my amendment number 3099 and ask that it be reported by number.
The clerk will report the amendment by number.
The senator from Idaho, Mr. Crapo, proposes an amendment number 3099.
Senators recognized.
Mr. President, the IRS financial instituting reporting requirement forces financial institutions to turn over detailed bank account information to the IRS based on vague and flexible criteria, such as a $600 threshold, and account inflows and outflows would be covered. This all to be determined by the IRS. Think about that. It subjects every law-abiding American who has a bank account or a credit union account in which they transact more than $600 worth of transactions to have that information monitored and reported to the IRS. This is an outrageous violation of the privacy of American citizens, and we should reject it. The community banks and credit unions support this amendment, and I thank the ICBA, CUNA, the ABA, and the NAFCU for their support, as well as the Americans for Tax Reform and the Center for a Free Economy. My amendment prevents the undue monitoring and reporting of sensitive financial information on law-abiding Americans.
Who yields time in opposition?
Mr. President.
Senator from Oregon.
Colleagues, a decade of Republican budget cuts to the IRS has resulted in rampant tax cheating at the top. Tax enforcement is going to require new resources and new tools to crack down on the high-flying tax cheats. The Crapo Amendment would, for all practical purposes, preserve the status quo that has contributed to the trillion-dollar tax gap, mushrooming and growing bigger. This amendment would make it harder to root out tax cheating, and it's unfair to working Americans who pay their taxes automatically out of each paycheck. Shortly, and we are going to reject the Crapo amendment, I'll offer an alternative that will protect the little guy without forfeiting the chance to go after the big tax cheats, the wealthiest. I urge the vote.
The question is on the amendment. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal.
No. Mr. Blunt votes yes.
Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young,